the Ammach project.
So welcome everybody. After the little break, we have David Griffin of Exopolitics UK, and how wonderful for us, he's a local lad. The alien language is the subject, and we're going to hear some amazing stuff. So as time is short, I'm going to let David get straight on with it. And big round of applause, please, for David.
1, 2, 2, okay. Hi there, nice to see you all here. Don't know if you can get this a tiny bit, I'm a bit taller than that. I'd like to say, that's great, I'd like to say this is the first event in Nottingham in, 7 years of doing these events and jetting off to like Liverpool and Southampton and various other places, Leeds, so it's very nice. I'm very proud that Joanne and Miles worked so hard to get a small gathering of people here, and I was just talking to Joanne before at the end of the last talk and saying how it's a nice venue, and hopefully we can do something here perhaps on a monthly basis or just get something going, because it's just far nicer. I don't know who came to Liverpool last time, but the venue's very good and you'll get a few more local people in, and the radio station there supported us for our last two. We had an ET Communications event and a general exopolitics event, but the venue isn't the best there and a lot of people don't like it, so this is plush surroundings, and it's good to see you all here. I hope you've all had a good day. I was a bit late, I'm afraid. As some of you will know, if you're Ammach devotees and you watch all their videos that do quite well online and have some quite cutting-edge stuff as far as things go, then you'll have seen some really interesting talks from many people, including Simon Parkes and Chantal, who I've had the pleasure of meeting outside. Really cutting-edge stuff that no one else dares put out, even on the realms of the Wild West of YouTube and stuff like that, where people won't tarnish their names and put out contactee stuff. Essentially, I started the first exopolitics node, framework, website, group, whatever you want to call it, outside of the US continent. It was a big thing, if any of you know the history, with people like Steve Bassett, who run the Paradigm Research Group, and Dr. Michael Saller, who set up the Exopolitics Institute, Alfred Weber, all those sort of people. And so they kicked it off in the US, and then slowly but surely we've now got, I think, 38 nations represented around the world and a cities initiative. As part of this, especially with the European lot, there's been a sort of a slight inkling toward, they'd rather direct things towards things like file release, what the government are going to do, how the government are going to disclose next week. And really, after you've been in this scene for a few years, you realise that a lot of that isn't going to happen. And one thing that I've always pushed for is that there's nothing wrong with the likes of exopolitics, which compared to ufology is meant to be sort of the respectable end of that. Well, bollocks to that, because I believe in bringing contactee accounts into exopolitics. I think it's the core of what the UFO issue is about. So a lot of my work is done with on the impact of the contactee paradigm within perhaps a political framework. This talk differs very slightly. I've done two talks before on alien language. The actual title of this, Sources Call's up there. So Sources Call was something that came around in 2007 when I interviewed a certain person who gave me an insight in how they were being tutored by these ETs on board these craft in a very, very bizarre way, and with some very bizarre methods of teaching them a new language. And it's a language like no other. It's a language that's totally different to us learning French at school on a blackboard with a few verbs. This is a paradigm shift in that, and other people have written about this. The guy called Mario Pasaglini did a lot of stuff on this years ago, and so it's an area I wanted to explore. Previous at Leeds, I did one on ETs interfacing humanity, or something along those lines, and basically saying that there's a struggle going on between the power structures and contactees. And I firmly believe that in this century, as things gear up, you can see that the power groups, or Illuminati, whatever we want to call them, are getting more and more desperate, to the point that we hear, if we believe certain phrases, that they are going after contactees from a young age and either killing them or doing various things to try and stop them progressing into more enlightened beings that can then talk to the rest of us. So there is a war on for this, and that was my theme of my last talk at Leeds, that in the 21st century, there is a war on for contactee information. Who controls the flow of contactee information? Because whoever controls that flow is going to control the future. Forget technology, forget everything else. It's the communication flow between ETs and ourselves that matters. And unfortunately, as we all know, it's the military that get most of this in a certain way, especially with that certain rather rogue, in most cases, grey species. It's the military that's usually by slamming these greys into a jail, some sort of prison or science lab, then they try and get them to talk. Contactees, on the other hand, abductees, whatever, on the whole, not always, tend to strike up a different sort of relationship and they get different sorts of information. Hence, you get these rather desperate men in black types who then follow, they have technology, they can find out where sources have been and perhaps an abduction has taken place. They then go and follow, as I met Chantel outside, as she'll tell you, they just magically turn up at these places where contact has taken place, and they then grill, sometimes quite violently. Many of us could name numerous cases where contactees and those that have been with them have been injured because these nefarious satellite groups, again, it's not the government, these are satellite groups that exist around the government. They want to know the information that those people have been given. So anyway, that was the talk at Leeds that I did. This one basically broadens it out a little bit, and I'm trying to broaden because I mix with a lot of the people from the European Exopolitics Initiative, a wide group of people, very active, very, very switched on people in their own way. In September 2008 or 9, I forget, Joanne was there, so she'll remind me. We had a meeting in Spain, and we had 1,500 people attend in this huge hotel. So 1,500 people for an event with exopolitics in the title shows you the appetite for this stuff. Unfortunately, you're the brave souls that come out and are prepared to come, and travel is expensive, etc. You'll come and attend events like this. The same with Liverpool, not a great turnout, but the same people turn up. We need to get this to the same sort of stage that is in Europe, where people are excited and will turn up and come to these things. So my attempt at trying to get this issue of exopolitics out of this realm of it's all to do with file release. Nick Pope's released yet another file, then David Clarke's waffling on about another file, and a pilot's seen another light in the sky. It's just like, we need something else that's actually going to sort of titillate people a bit and get their interest going. So I'm trying to bring in a few new dimensions here, so bear with me for a bit. You'll see where this fits in at the end. So I'll just start. I'm aware of I'm pushed for time, so I'm just going to keep checking this now and then. Okay. Right. Okay, so I mentioned before about the flow of ET communication and how, there's this battleground now between the satellite government, who, don't forget, are infinitely funded. All of us have probably broken the bank trying to get here. Certainly to other conferences. If you attend just British conferences alone, if you attend 3 a year, that's a hefty amount of money in travel and tickets and hotels and everything else. It's unfortunately the military have a limited budget, so they can do all this sort of thing. They can follow contactees around. They can take down ships and interview ETs and think they're getting the information from that. We can't do that, so we need another sort of approach. Of course, in 1947, the US basically brought about the national security state as discussed in depth by people like Richard Dolan. And so that goes into the whole idea that essentially after Roswell, the national security state, which of course wasn't just American, this spread all over the world. Whatever America does, they make sure by their little satellite diplomatic agents, whatever else, that also takes place. Using control of the media, they basically get the say on how we should respond to the ET issue. So at the moment, there's a lot of weird things going on. We're in this, what we call I call the post-Roswell time frame. Everything's changed since that time. National security state. We've got this weird 2012 thing coming up, which no one really knows what's about, but it's certainly on its way fast. And if you've all noticed, time is speeding up. Strange things are starting to happen faster. But on the whole, of course, my talk is mostly to do with language. And as someone that's read a lot on language, which incidentally was a dual. It was like a dual approach of mine. So as I was sort of learning, I was at college. Even before college, I was picking up books at age 16 from the library on people like Timothy Leary, other stuff. Noam Chomsky, who I didn't stick a chance of reading, that went right over my head. All these sort of people, but having a go at trying to understand. I've always had a fixation with language. Well, when I discovered the ET issue and found out that aliens were communicating in symbols and telepathy and all this sort of stuff, then there was a slight mix of these things called psychedelics, which I don't know how far to go with. Different audiences are more receptive to that area. Some people recoil in shock because technically these things are drugs. Other people understand a bit more that the drugs can be separated into two issues. Some are about expanding consciousness, some do the reverse. And so anyway, those three things mixed together made me very interested in the issue of language. And ETs and language and psychedelics, as you'll see, becomes quite a fascinating area. So reality is made of language. These are just the points to introduce this whole thing. Reality is made of language, and that's totally true. If you go back and read all the linguists from the sort of 19th century and stuff, there's people like Wittgenstein and Ben told me, I didn't believe him at the time, Ben told me he was actually a hospital porter, and I thought, oh, Ben's talking rubbish, he's not a hospital porter. But Ben was dead right, that guy is full of facts. Wittgenstein was a top linguist, and he was also a hospital porter. So yeah, reality is made of language. So, if I point to, I can point to Ben, but if I hadn't said the word Ben, you wouldn't know who he is. If I point to that chair, then, I don't say the word chair, you've not got a clue what it is. It might have a form, but you can't describe it, you can't do anything really with it, you can't communicate about the chair because you really don't know what it is. More importantly, a species can only advance as fast as its language, just as an infant, when they're born, and gradually learn these different things to do with food, bed, me want food, all this sort of stuff. The same, that works then on a meta level with the species, that our species can only evolve as fast as its language. And that's a really true situation. A lot of people sort of have a problem with that, but it's completely true. Language maps our reality. It also constrains us, but while we have no map for our world, which is linguistic, then we don't actually progress. And then finally, the final point, hidden amongst the high strangeness of the UFO issue is a key element of our next stage of evolution and a complete transformation in how we see ourselves. Now, that may sound a little bit far out, but I think by the end of this, I'm hoping that you'll see my view on that is a little bit closer than you may think at the moment. Okay, because I did this last time at Leeds in an hour and a half, I'm going to have to skip a few things, but I'll try and do it well. Try and do it without losing too much context. Most of you will have heard of the Tower of Babel. To me, beyond the Garden of Eden and Genesis and stuff like this always fascinated me. I was brought up as a mild sort of Christian with a mild Christian family. We had a chapel over the road in this country village, and of course, now and then, after falling asleep through most of the Sunday school, they told a story to do with something that really made my ears stand on end, and the Tower of Babel was one of those things. So I'll just read it, because don't forget, this came from Genesis, just like the Garden of Eden, and again, think about Garden of Eden, all to do with the fall, all to do with the idea that, these are the things I want you to think about, all to do with the idea that we were in one state, then something happened, suddenly we were in another state. And all the way through this talk, I've tried to put things into either red or bold, and these are the bits that, both for my own benefit as I was putting it together and for people watching, that if you take notice of those, they're the points I'm trying to make, because these will fit in later on as we go through the whole project. So I'll read a few of these out quickly. Most of you hopefully can read those. So essentially, this tower, some people, just like Noah's Ark, you get these weirdos going out with their shovels saying, yeah, I found Noah's Ark halfway up a mountain, and it's the real thing. And, there's been about 30 of these all around the planet, so I don't know what's going on with that. And the same with the Tower of Babel. Someone claimed they found the Tower of Babel. Well, actually, if it did exist and wasn't a metaphor, as I think it was, then the thing should be absolutely ginormous. So anyway, so Genesis, main chapter of the Bible. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and therefore confuse their language, that's important, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from where over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. And then the final bit at the bottom left, therefore its name was called Babel, or Babel, because the Lord confused the language of all the earth. So just bear that in mind as we go through the rest of this. Something was going on with our linguistic and conceptual ability when we first got chucked on this planet. Something happened. We got very good at a certain thing, or we were born with an innate ability to do something, and something went a bit haywire. Okay, so trying to bring in both sides of this, so the idea of the language, the idea that something happened as a rupture in the language, then we bring in the issue of psychedelics. And most of you will have probably heard about these if you've not had a past that's rooted in sort of the hippie scene when you're in your teenagers, or the rave scene if you went out and took acid and E's at these raves and danced madly all night. Then some of you might have come across what I call the harder psychedelics. We're not talking sort of MDMA, this sort of thing here, or cannabis or anything. We're talking these harder psychedelics. This is what at the moment people like David Icke and many other, I call them, it's like middle class. It's all sorts of people, but the middle classes often now are going over to the Amazon basin, finding a shaman, and they're doing a couple of days worth of taking these substances. There's a picture of DMT there from Rick Strassman's book. If I can see, I can read it better on the screen than I can on here. DMT is very similar to ayahuasca. Ayahuasca's what they take in the jungle. It's a brew. And all of these things, ayahuasca, I've got the list up there, ayahuasca, DMT, ibogaine, psilocybin. All these things are endogenous to the planet, and an awful lot of plants have these sort of things in. And the idea is that, of course, you douse your nervous system with these things, and various things start to happen. Allegedly, your consciousness expands. You start seeing weird shit, but there's a whole new dimension. As you'll see, there's a whole new dimension to this thing. So I've put beneath. That's Terence. I'm going to talk a lot about Terence McKenna, or a fair bit. That's Dennis McKenna. Terence McKenna, sadly, and I miss him at the moment, because his take on what's going on in the world would be a complete blessing. And the guy died of brain cancer, unfortunately, early. Dennis is his brother, who's a chemist, and he was also out in the Amazon jungle with him doing these experiments. So 2 key points. These substances open up the possibility of obtaining alien, i.e. novel, so I mean alien in the sense of foreign, but also alien in the sense of alien as we know it, information. They also facilitate a shift in perception and a new linguistic paradigm. I jumped on there. Yeah, one of the most fascinating and actually mind-bending aspects to all this sort of stuff is the fact that, of course, I mentioned the groups of people from the West, Americans and for Europe, going over and getting a shaman to take them on this psychedelic voyage using ayahuasca, this vine that's brewed in the Amazon. Of course, while we've been busy on the stock market, running up huge amounts of debts and sending the world to hell in the handbasket, buying Ferraris that then essentially of course, Amazonian tribes and many other tribes, including the Bwiti tribe in Africa, who deal with ibogaine, which is the other substance that I mentioned. They magically for years have known about this brew, and if you work out how many species of plant that have got active ingredients in somewhere like the Amazon, you're into thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions, and yet it takes to form this thing called ayahuasca, which most people are overtaking at the moment. It takes 2 chemicals to do it, and you have to brew those chemicals in a certain way to get it to work, and for a certain amount of time. One's a vine, and then the other thing, you need what you call an MAO inhibitor, which stops it then breaking down in the gut, which DMT, which is often found out in the West, if you smoke it, it lasts literally like 5 minutes. So, of course, if you want this 6-hour extended trip or adventure where you can learn a lot more under the support of a shaman, then the mixture of ayahuasca will stop it breaking down in the gut and will give you this actual full experience for 6 hours instead of the 5 minutes. So of course, while we've been doing our thing in the West for thousands of years, these groups have actually been taking this stuff. And what is the most mind-blowing part about this is, of course, how on earth did they find that out of these millions of plants, you go and pick a vine off one thing, then you get a root of something else, you boil it up for so long, and you get this absolutely mind-bending substance that's then been used in shamanic ceremonies for actually thousands of years. So there's two chemical keys, and somehow they found those. What was that? Was that off-planet beings that made these things glow? Was it message into their heads? Did ETs come down and do their first brew, as they probably did with fire, and say, this is how you do it? There's a strong link between ET visitation and these plants, in my view. And if I remember rightly, this is when the mouse comes up. Yep.
Telepathic and group mind states are induced by this particular plant mixture, and it's particularly interesting in the light of the fact that the chemical constituents which make it go are in fact found endogenously in the human brain. These are not exotic compounds from the point of view of ordinary human brain chemistry. So there is a suggestion there that manipulation of neurohumoral compounds, brain neurotransmitters, and that sort of thing may in fact open the door to untapped areas of human potential.
One of the games my brother liked to play with the mushrooms was, in this dialogue situation, he was always saying, tell me something I can't possibly know, right? And that will validate that it's not me, that this is coming from. I don't know that he ever succeeded in getting it. It's very cagey, they're very tricky that way. It's, but occasionally they do seem to tell people things that they can't possibly know, or that they've never thought about in the...
Is it possible to get something that no one else has known about by taking these substances either in your own house or in the Amazon jungle, as the McKenna brothers literally did in the early 70s, went out and spoke to strange beings and stuff. And it's the same sort of thing, of course, as contactees do. There's analogies going on where you find abductees, contactees going out and get on board a ship and get told lots of weird stuff. And then they have to come back and try and integrate that, not only into their own lives, which is hard enough, but then, as seems to be the way, part of the whole process is to encourage them to tell other people about their experience. And, what a job to do, that you've got to then come back with some of these very strange ideas. Forget the fact you're picked up by green-eyed monsters with weird-shaped heads. You've got to then go on and say, well, they also told me this about the planet, and they told me this about the timeline that we're on, and all this sort of stuff. So, similarities going on there between that and what Terence McKenna's brother was going on about there. As a quick note, what a lot of people don't know, although they might know more recently, is that very British... there were 3 people who found out about the DNA helix and actually discovered it. Frances Crick was one. There's a lady called she's called the Dark Lady that no one talks about. So the 2 males, Crick and Watson, are given the Nobel Prize and all the praise for finding this, but actually there's a lady working hard in the background. But that's by and by. That's just part of our society. And he actually claims that when he first saw that infamous double helix spiral that we all know, and we now all see on the medical thing, which the name which I keep forgetting, then that spiral he first saw when he took LSD, because obviously Albert Hofmann invented LSD in it came out 45-ish, wasn't it, somewhere around there, and so he was part of this British elite, like Aldous Huxley and many others, who took LSD when it came around. It was known then as it was the intelligence people's thing. Then, of course, it all went haywire, and we had the 1960s, and mad hippies started rolling around in dirt and having lots of sex, and all that sort of stuff happens as LSD leaked onto the streets, mostly facilitated by the good old CIA, apparently. So again, made a point at the bottom, ET contacts and communication is a catalyst for the simmer spaces in reality. In other words, if Francis Crick, a genius scientist, is prepared to come out towards the end of his life, he couldn't at the start, and say, yep, I first saw the double helix and started to understand what it's about on an LSD trip, then that shows that this sort of stuff has power, just as contactees or aliens that turn up and also pass on this sort of novel information. Again, another point about West versus East. So, we've got the whole idea that the ET communication issue is all about, we advanced Westerners, we see things like the metallic ships, we've got all this technology that we can detect them. Western people seem to have a certain experience to do with contacting ETs. We've got an idea that their ship should be super stealthy, round-shaped or triangular-shaped. And so you'd expect then something perhaps different if this is cultural to a degree, these cultural differences. This is a guy called Pablingo Amaringo. And basically, he is very famous for leading. He does sort of ayahuasca sessions. Seen as a bit of a shaman down there. Been around for years. Worked with an artist called Alex Gray, who's a psychedelic artist. But I put these in just because they make a point, and they're also beautiful paintings. You can go and find these on the web, or you can buy his book in full colour and see these. So again, bear in mind, someone that's grew up in the Amazon region has no contact with the Western world, and basically does his drawings based on his ayahuasca visions. So these are just a few of those that I'll skip through briefly, and they always have got saucers in them. So this guy sat in the jungle always mentions saucers. As you can see, you can read these things for yourself at the top. 2 dazzling spaceships hasten to make contact with human beings. They come from the Pleiades. Well, that's a common planet that everyone mentions, Above is a flying saucer that comes from one of Saturn's satellites. Really sort of psychedelic art, but again with this alien dimension. Several spaceships fly over the cultivated fields, carrying people of great wisdom who come to give strength to the ayahuasca, i.e. that substance we mentioned, brew. Another one there about some part of the galaxy, again on the right, saucers with little beings on top. That's the one I wanted. Where's that one gone? This one I thought was interesting because, of course, we think, since Whitley Strieber, we think the whole idea of ETs coming down and sticking probes in various places and doing these operations, surgical operations, all this sort of stuff, which is perhaps no doubt true. But we tend to think, well, that didn't appear till Whitley Strieber and a few others started talking about this whole idea of these weird greys coming and doing very strange things to us in our beds at night or on hospital tables. And yet, here we have someone that isn't exposed to that Western mindset who does a whole painting around this. These things must take him days to do. We see a flying object that approaches the house where ayahuasca is taken. It comes from Mars, and in it come goblins, expert in surgical operations. So again, back not exposed to the Western reality or the Western mindset, and yet he also experiences these commonalities that we experience. Along the lines of McKenna, the 2 guys that went out very early, way ahead of the time, went out, decided what they'd done the whole San Francisco hippie scene. That was their thing, and they'd been out and done that. So they thought, bollocks to it, we'll go somewhere else. We'll go to where these plants came from, and we'll go and try and contact some aliens. So the McKennas set off down into the Amazon basin, went there for several years, and of course, during that time, they met thousands and thousands of different types of shamans or shamans. What was the most mind-blowing part for me, if you can go and read their book, it's called True Hallucinations, and it basically, an amazing read, goes through their whole trek all the way there, how they set up camp, how they got to know the locals, how they started trying to hunt down this vine for ayahuasca, which at that time was very hard to find. Very few people would trust them down there and say, yeah, come this way, I'll knock you a brook, because they weren't used to Westerners at that time. All they knew is these bizarre botanist or anthropologist that would turn up and usually, they chop their head off or something. Well, I'm not saying they're all like that, but, they weren't exposed to that Western thing, so they didn't trust people. What they did come across is the psilocybin mushroom that was growing everywhere. Now, we have these growing in our fields. If you go out in October and autumn, you'll find these things. They have like a little nipple on top, and people take them, people eat them raw anyway, and they're quite strong. They give you this psychedelic trip. Well, there's an even stronger version in the Amazon, and probably no doubt in other parts of the world. They like damp, warm conditions, so they started taking those things. And one of the things they found is when they took these things and they met shamans, then shamans, as many of you will know, to guide the trip of the person who's taken. They always do it in a group, which is where we go wrong in the West. If you look into the work of Ewan Cameron, who was a mind control guy in Canada, but did loads of stuff for the CIA, many other people, Britain, we did it, Portland Down, all that sort of stuff, all to do with mind control and how we could create Manchurian candidates to go and shoot Bobby Kennedy and all this sort of stuff. This was all practiced. They used many of these drugs to practice on this sort of thing. But of course, what have you got there? You've got a clinical hospital setting with people in white coats and you in a bed and people coming to measure your blood pressure now and then. In the Amazon, in the tribe, it's totally different. You've got a shaman there who guides the trip, you're supported, anything goes wrong, they can help. And their main purpose of doing that, apart from, of course, getting the dose right, is that they will sing and they shake rattles. And these songs over the millennia have turned out to be an art form in guiding the trip or the meditation or the contacts that you want to have. If you want to contact other beings, they can initiate that with certain songs, and you have this group mind that's created. These songs are called Icaros, and they're designed to actually drive the visual aspect of the trip, and they can sort of steer it in certain ways. The propensity of what these things do, one of the main, according to McKenna, one of the main issues that they seem to deal with, and one of the things they seem to catalyse, is the linguistic ability itself. So we have we have this strange term that McKenna calls the language elves, and I always get this wrong when I say it, self-transforming machine elves of hyperspace. And essentially, if you take DMT or ayahuasca, you are propelled, not the most pleasant not the most pleasant substance to take, actually. Done it myself a few times and feels like something's sitting on your chest. Breathing slows down to nothing. The most weird part is, compared to other psychedelics that perhaps people have taken, or even meditation sessions, is that most of you will know, if you've dabbled in these things occasionally, when you open your eyes and you're on a dance floor or you're at a party or something, then you'll get some semblance of reality back. When you take things like DMT, that goes. Whether your eyes are open or shut, you're propelled into this bizarre alien hive. That's all it's like. It's like a hive with weird intelligences looking back at you at the other side. Now, not everyone gets this, but a lot of people seem to perhaps meet entities. But anyway, McKenna's named them, and it's interesting that he calls them the language elves, because what these things do when they talk to you, they encourage you to think with your mind and create linguistic phenomena, but crucially in a visual form. So there's some catalyzing process going on here, that when you take these substances, there are legitimate, just as legitimate as anyone else that said, I met an ET on board a craft. There is a legitimate alien intelligence on the other side that encourage you. McKenna says here, they want you to make a better, and that's the important word, a better kind of language. So if we struggle with our day-to-day language, to and fro, very sort of linear, backwards and forwards, we're always getting things wrong, we always fall into arguments, and most of that's because we don't know what we're trying to describe to that other person. He also puts, this is not the logical linear process of verbs and adjectives, nor is it about being more articulate. That's an interesting point. It's a dimensional shift that's being encouraged. And I put a point at the bottom there that I thought was really crucial. This shift is going to be a bigger bootstrapping process than when written language first magically arrived in the human species. And of course, if you do your evolutionary history, you'll know that language seemed to appear, we'll cover this a bit later, suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And yet, if you then follow, as language then moved from this sort of vocal utterances to then written language and stuff, then this species accelerated, trade began, all sorts of stuff happened. So language, of course, is innate to us. You've got all these weirdos that take monkeys and chimpanzees out of zoos and try to train them to speak the odd few words, and they all fail dismally at it because they're not wired for it. We're wired for language, and in a very special way.
That sound is a wave. And it leaves somebody's mouth, say, or it leaves a loudspeaker, and it goes wiggly, wiggly, wiggly through the air. Well, I have to disappoint you if you think that is the case. Sound does not do that. Sound is actually spherical. So every sound that you've ever heard from the moment of your birth has been spherical. Now here's a nice diagram to demonstrate this, but before we get to the diagram, let me just talk you through the thing. We have vocal folds, little flap of skin that vibrates up and down. What happens in the throat when that little flap of skin vibrates up and down because of the passage of air coming up from our lungs is that a little pearl of sound is created. And here it is, that little pearl. It's a tiny little pearl, spherical pearl of sound. Rapidly expands up our throats, through our mouths. Some of it goes up through our nasal cavities. Two bubbles are formed, one in front of our lips, and one comes down the nasal cavity and joins the main passage of sound out through the mouth. And in a split second, we have this beautiful bubble of sonic energy standing in front of our lips. Of course, it doesn't stand. It actually is moving very fast. But if you can just visualize it statically for a moment. So here it is. Here's the little bubble coming out of the mouth. And on the surface of that bubble is a beautiful pattern. And that is the pattern that represents all the structure in your beautiful voice. And of course, as I said, it doesn't sit there. It rapidly expands away at round about 700 miles an hour. So it's quite hard to kind of visualize, but you can see here a very large sphere that's been drawn, just to give you the impression that it's moving away from the head.
I wanted to use that just to explain that we all think sounds as waves, but the research that's been done shows, and I think I found this picture online, and I just think that beautifully sort of shows actually what's actually happening. And like you said, when we talk, it's actually at light speed, not light speed, speed of sound. Anyway, it's really, really fast. So of course, we don't see that sort of imagery there, but what does that sort of thing remind you of? I mean, it's seen pictures of orbs when people have posted them. You know, you've got some bizarre stuff going on inside there. I'm not saying that's an accurate picture of what this sound bubble is, but it's an interesting description, I thought, with the whole way that we actually speak in these bubbles. If we slowed everything down, that's what we'd see. The interesting point is that if we go back to sort of McKenna and when he went to the Amazon, what they actually found, as well as McKenna finding these machine elves when he took DMT, that there's this alien hive that you could communicate with, and they encouraged him to use his vocal cords to make sounds, and with those sounds in his mind's eye would then follow pictures that you could shift the geometry of these pictures. What I forgot to say at that point, probably due to flicking through these slides at this rate at the moment, with these vague errors, what I forgot to say at that point is one of the most crucial things, that amazingly, when he went down there, he ended up in a circle once of sort of 30 shamans, and these were all experienced shamans that regularly communed together with each other, using guttural voices and humming, and also generating in their mind's eye. So as their system was perturbed with this psychedelic chemical, which essentially is, this is nothing alien. This is a chemical linked to the pineal glands that you've all heard much about, that basically, once you take these vines, these mixture of plants, this basically causes a release of dopamine, all these other neurotransmitters, serotonin, all the stuff that we know. But we know the pineal gland is very heavily involved with DMT. The absolutely mind-blowing thing that happened is he realized that these shamans were communicating to each other in color. So one would say, yep, I'm sending you a purple dot with green spikes in it, and it's going to have a magenta middle. But this would all have meaning to them. They weren't saying this sort of thing. In their heads, this is what's going on. The other person then across the other side of the room in the hut or wherever they were would then say, "Yep, I like that magenta ball that you sent me with green spikes, but I thought it could have done with a slightly different shape and a different hue in this place." And this was all taking place not just in the it almost felt like, from what I remember what McKenna said, like it was a central part of the room. So this group mind had manifested itself in part of the room, as well as in the mind's eye of the people taking part. So what's going on when shamans can literally, because this isn't down to them being shamans and having 10 years of training and the dad was a shaman, this stuff. No, this is we're all capable of this sort of stuff. So something rather fantastic is going on, that instead of having to sit around with a cup of tea or a nice Chardonnay or whatever else, then they take these substances and they zap these colours and these concepts around the group to each other. And then when the trip is over and it's dying down, they discuss that and they start saying, well, I think that's a good omen because, we passed around this colour and this concept came to my mind when we did this. So all this sort of stuff's going on. This made Terence McKenna, it enthused him. He came back and he wrote a whole load of stuff on this, and it's been one of his sort of raison d'etre for until he died. This was one of the key points that started much of his research off when he got back from the Amazon in the 70s. Interestingly as well, many of you will have heard of cymatics. David Icke got really into cymatics at a certain point. I think he went and met probably this guy that did this sort of stuff. But again, when we're talking about humans who can talk and make things visible, then have a look at how the human voice sounds in a visual format. Because, of course, when I'm talking to you now, you hear this slightly flat, usually slightly monotonous voice, and yet when we start to sing, and there's something to do with tones, and it always seems to be when you talk to the shamans that make these patterns in their heads, it's a guttural sort of chant. Like when you do the om noise, when we make the om noise, or when people, if you play the didgeridoo, or when people sing in harmony, the vocal cords are capable of doing far more than we realise. And you can see when this lady hits certain notes in this, you get this unique pattern that comes up. So I thought this was interesting to include. This is the human voice made visible. The human voice is capable of amazing things. No wonder it's used in healing more and more. People chant, and it's no accident that things like the om sound are there for a certain reason, and you can tell when it hits these certain frequencies that really resonate with you. Okay, so that's the background. Now we're getting on to the contactee side of things, and really, I'm a complete nerd for contact accounts. I could probably have chosen 30-odd cases which suit what I'm trying to say now with regard to language and where contactees are introduced to ETs or brought onto a craft, whatever the circumstance, and they first describe the language which takes place and how that language gels in their own head. You know, in the 50s, in the Space Brothers eras, if any of you are fans of that, then we used to have these sci-fi ETs that walked around with special gadgets on the belt, and they were like, yeah, that's the transmissions device. Well, you know, then bizarrely things change. That goes out of fashion, and you get other things. This guy, great guy, he has given. He's an engineer. Never really was into any of this. Didn't know anything about the ET issue. Was picked up one night with his car, and I think this is one of the best descriptions, apart from the one we're going to go on to. I think this is one of the best descriptions of what's going on. So bear in mind some of the stuff that I put in red about having language and tones and all that sort of stuff, and a lot more of this will fit in the next few slides after. But this is Alec Newald describing his first experience.
We seem to have adopted, even though my body looked to be similar, I was 40 years of age at that stage, similar body structure to what I'd had prior to the crash in the car, but it was now blue. And it was explained to me that with the blue body came an ability to interact. A communication device was built into the body, if you like. And that language was like something you could not imagine on this planet. There were no real words as such. We had a colour which was accompanied by a resonance, but the resonance was more like a song. They were singing to me in colour. And because all of this was internal, this was telepathic, obviously, even though I had never experienced it before to my memory, and I didn't realise what telepathy would be like, of course. I don't think many of us really do when it's full-blown. And accompanying these songs, these rhythms, these harmonic wavelengths, followed by the colour, which was just flowing through my head, were images. And because this was being deciphered for me automatically, it was just like speaking to you now or you speaking to me. I would know what you were saying automatically. I didn't have to interpret it. It was naturally. It looks and sounds to be so confusing to have colours in your head and vibrations in your head and pitches in your head. But along with that experience, it was they could download so much information so quickly, and it was all perfectly natural.
I thought that was I mean, yeah, I've got these back. His notice he used, I haven't got it down there, he used the word tapestry, which is really weird because you'll find that a lot of contactees use exactly that term. They'll use the word, it was a tapestry, but when you go on to read more in depth, it's like, it's not just a tapestry you look at, this is a tapestry that is all-encompassing. You know, you get to feel, live, and be part of that tapestry of language. You know, nothing like the detached process that we undertake in our day-to-day lives. Something else is going on, and you start to get these repeating words. With contactees going through this, you get these strange repeating words, the words that we use normally for things like art. You know, if you're at some arty-farty gallery and you're seeing something, you'll talk about, well, that painting resonates with me, you know, and I don't know, has a certain vibrates in a certain way with my consciousness. I don't know, whatever. But you start finding you know, your average run-of-the-mill contactee suddenly absolutely absorbed by this whole notion of this new language system, which is a visual-based language system that actually comes across their sort of consciousness. Those of you that came to Liverpool, not Leeds, if you came to Liverpool, you will have seen Dan Sherman come and talk. Now, going back to what I said at the start, he is, you know, I mentioned this, well, this is on a very rudimentary level. There's a war going on between, you've got the satellite agencies, which is mostly military with a few politicians and a few rich corporations mixed in. And then you've got the rest of us, the contactees, and these researchers that are also trying to get to the bottom of what's going on. Well, Dan Sherman was one of the rare people that came out from within a very deep black project. In fact, it was beyond black. He called it a slant or grey project, which essentially very, very interesting. He described the whole process, basically saying that it's like, like the classic onion. Wrapped inside a black project, you get this grey project, grey meaning alien, and then in a base above that, you then also have a normal project going on. So even the manager, captain, whatever, of the black project has no clue what's going on in the grey project. And apparently they started that off in the mid-70s because they began to feel that UFO enthusiasts were beginning to make inroads into things. So again, this war over who controls the flow of ET contacts communication is evident there at that moment. Just if you saw his talk, you'll have found out a lot more. But for those of you who hadn't, basically he was just, his mother was genetically altered to the point where he was then ready. By the time he was encouraged to join the military, they then moved him to this special school, which he did along with his normal job. And his job was to, amazingly, because it fits into the whole thing that we're trying to say here and the point I'm trying to get over, he had to start by his first humming tones, and then gradually, with his mind alone, he sat in front of a computer for this, he managed to flatten most of you know what sine waves are, you'll see an image in a minute. He managed to flatten these sine waves that we all used to see on oscilloscopes at school. Gradually, after 4 or 5 days of this struggle, he managed to flatten these lines and went on to do a lot more, a huge lot more, including getting transmission from, as he feels, was a legitimate ET somewhere else, somewhere in the next room, in the next galaxy. He didn't ever find out. It's the military, you can't find these things out. His job, incidentally, for those that don't know, was as an IC, an integrative communicator. His role would be that apparently the ETs had said there's going to be a huge EMP blast soon, whether that's from the sun or from an enemy or whatever. All communications are going to go down. We need certain people that don't rely on normal methods to actually communicate, and they're going to train all these people up so that they've got some method of communicating with each other and with this grey rogue, if you want to call them that. Are they rogue if they work with the military? I don't know. So this grey group had said they'd teach the people how to communicate with them intuitively, and he got very good at this. What's important is he began to, the point I'm going to start making when we come to other contactees, there's something else is going on. Aside from this thing is not like a blackboard exercise when you were doing French at school. This thing is completely different. There is a holographic dimension to this conversation, to this communication, to the point where the body becomes, I think, like some sort of DNA antenna, and there's a weird feedback going on. You'll see this in a minute. So if you notice that, as he improved, he began to feel the achieved shifts in these lines boxes. There's that, I'll flick forward one. There's the boxes he was doing. This, I mean, this guy, if you saw him talk, totally legitimate. No way he's making this up. Yeah, fair enough, he sold a book on it, but his story was absolutely incredible. So this is an image I nicked off Richard Hall. I'm sure he won't mind. And that shows, it's a mock-up of him at the station. As you can see up there, you've got the sine wave. In the bottom box there, that was videos that he was meant to eventually, there was part of his job was then to get feedback from these videos. He could alter certain things that went on. But these are sine waves. That's the sort of stuff he was doing. But again, notice the quote he gives in the book when I read it. The goal of my 4th week was to master flattening lines in different combinations of the boxes at once. By this time, I could only feel the movement in the boxes. Only later did I realise it was quite similar to communicating with my alien contacts. The windows were not only responding to my input, I could sense their output as well. And that's important. Again, it comes back to this feedback loop between what seemed to be these inanimate objects, these boxes that are on the wall. He could feel a dual process going on, that as he could flatten the lines and communicate according to this system that was set up, then at the same time he could feel these changes going on and some sort of communication from them. Mike's here at the moment. The other point I mentioned about alien language that seems to crop up a lot as well, I just did a brief slide on Mike for the last event. In one deep hypnosis session, Mike produced 14 pages of imagery and symbols. Now, I spoke to him about this for 10 minutes in Liverpool. But the point I want to make is that comes over again and again with these symbols, that something happens when people touch these symbols. I don't know if you know all about Jim Penniston, when he went to Rendlesham and touched the symbols on the craft, if you believe all that, and strange things happened. He had a flashback about time and some mad download. Well, this seems to be a recurring thing. At times when tracing the symbols, became very moved by the meaning of the symbols. So somehow these symbols that have this ET dimension seem to have some process by which they holographically contain elements of either the person or the species that actually put those symbols together. I don't know what's going on there, but this is a recurring theme. This lady is part of a very famous family, the Andreasen family, who also had a lot to do with alien language. Loads more happened with their basic contact accounts too. But Becky Andreasen, she also received training in alien symbols by the use of dual-raised alien keys. So I take it one was an ET key, one was a normal language key. This symbolic language is taught by use of the mind, sense of touch, colour and sound. So that's just her. And again, she was put on board ship. That's why I call the talk Saucer School. She was put on board ship and was taught to use these, to manipulate these various symbols to learn this language. Now we get on to Jim Sparks, who is sort of the ultimate in all of these cases. He really came out early, and because he has what people call, or what he terms 90% recall. Most contactees, as we know, come back with dribs and drabs of stuff, especially, it seems, when, I've asked an awful lot of people about the language issues, and not a lot comes back. Jim Sparks, who's written that book, he's written The Keepers, great book, great read if you want to get it. Still, I think he sells it on his site and from Amazon. But essentially, in 2007, I was so enthralled by this subject still, and because he mentioned language a lot, I interviewed him. And he said some amazing stuff and actually gave me an in-depth view and take on what all this was about, because Saucer School was essentially what happened to him. Now, he was taken, again, no interest in the ET phenomena, nothing at all, was happily working for a real estate company, I think, and suddenly started getting taken and would find himself on board a ship, and all they made him do is sit in a chair and said, right, learn these symbols. And he had all these little greys around him, some of the taller greys, and he had to trace, although when you'll see pictures sometimes, if you look on the web about this, you'll see a console in front of him. That was part of the instructional device, but mostly he was tracing symbols and alphabets in the air. That was his task, and it was painstakingly slow. And of course, the guy, because he managed to keep this consciousness, he had a lot of memory when he came back. He started getting pissed off at the fact that there was, it was like going back to school. So he ended up in fights with some of these greys and wanted to get out and stuff. So he had a lot of problems in the early days. He's actually now, if you speak to him, he's very thankful for his experience and he appreciates what they did for him. But at the time, they'd use bizarre methods, like if he didn't behave or wouldn't carry on tracing a letter, they had a method whereby which they would alter the pressure in the UFO itself, and this would cause him huge pain to the point where he virtually passed out. And so he was then like, stop, and then he'd carry on a bit more, and then if he misbehaved again, they'd do that. So, this was a carrot and stick operation. There's a lot more stick, it seemed, to carrot. They were really quite cruel in the way. It was almost like a boot camp for him. Interestingly, he did get some rewards, like they let him do certain things. They train him to do certain things, like raise things off the ground and other stuff. Tell him a bit about his past. Amazing stuff that he learned in those situations. But those interviews, I don't have a lot of time to play them all now because I've got audio of them. Those interviews can all be found, that site, that they were done in 2007. Go to go to Google, type in Exopolitics UK and type in Jim Sparks. There's 2 times 2 hours on that. If you're interested in this area, you'll find that quite enjoyable, I think. One section is called A New 3D Language, and then there's another one I've forgotten the title of, but, really worth listening to. Linked into that, Jim, interesting what you say about the hologram and stuff. I've got a question on the way you were taught the language, and it seems that over many years you were taught this language system on board the craft that basically went from tracing the basic letters, the letter system out, to over time then gradually moving objects with sort of thought alone. My sort of question on this is, when you were first at the start of that process and you were tracing the letters out for the alien alphabet with your fingers, did you notice any? I think you mentioned in the book, but I couldn't find it recently. Did you feel anything sort of in your mind or in your body as you were tracing those letters out that gave you a sign of perhaps what was to come with regard to moving the objects?
Yeah, it was scary, actually. It was haunting. It was, and it felt like an invasion. And understanding that in those early years until things progressed, they were not informative as to what to expect. It was motion, direction, and sounding it out in your mind. When you would translate or duplicate, in a sense, again, simple block text. So that might be the letter A, and then in your mind you're sounding it out when you're duplicating an alien symbol representing the letter A. You're sounding it out as you sketch it with your finger, and and the motion was extremely important. Like the longhand version of the letter A was 1 stroke to the right, straight. Parallel, 1 stroke to the left, 1 stroke to the right. So you would go in your mind, you would sound it out in your mind, the motion had to be precise, and you would sketch it as 1, 2, 3, A. What I was learning was the fact that we as humans, when we think, our thoughts are not uniform. If I say, how are you today, in my mind, or if I even verbalize it to you, and you say, how are you today, brain waves scatter all over creation, and there's no real uniformity to how you're saying how are you and to how I'm saying how are you. So for telepathic purposes, or to telepathically direct machinery through a thought-activated technology, there's no structure there for the receiving end to pick it up. So what was being done there, and one aspect of what was being done was to transform thoughts into a symbolic form that then could be read. And as time went on, as I learned more on how to convert letters into these symbols, then for incentive, they would be more cooperative in interaction if I used that new technique to communicate with them, both back and forth.
And that one?
That when you take an individual who's very good at Morse code, when they're first learning Morse code, they're hearing what everybody else would hear, dot, 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 dash, the dot, dot, dash, dash. They're hearing something, and they're converting it by the sequence into letters which form sentences. However, when one gets skilled and seasoned in Morse code, they're not really hearing that anymore. They're not hearing the dots and the dashes and the spaces. They're actually hearing the sentence in their mind.
Sure.
And it's the same. I'm seeing kind of the same thing, only we're verbalizing that through, there's sound, audio here, where it's the same sense. Now, at first it might be stroke to the right, stroke to the left, stroke to the right is A. You sense it. Now I vibrate to it if you're thinking it, and I rock back and forth, so to speak. I'm being very crude. I know that's an A. But there's a shorthand version of it. And then when you start putting together in words and symbols, the next thing you know, you're hearing what someone's saying that's skilled at that in your mind. And henceforth, you transmit it the same way, symbolic form, and they're getting it in their mind. So
sure.
It's all basic stuff. So I think I was, one could say gifted. I thought I was cursed all those years, but gifted with the basics of that. Of course, it's, I share it with the human race.
He basically was taught this whole process. And the point I was going to make to do it was that because I managed to go into detail with him on the phone, because I knew about this stuff, I was interested in this whole idea of, well, what's happening when people are tracing these symbols and learning this language? So, bless him in a way, he spent hours on the phone with me going through these, and, he's not a hugely articulate man in his own way, but he did his best to put it over, and he came across with some amazing stuff. So as he traced these letters, he would say his words were things like, as I traced one letter, I realised that, as I was doing it, I rocked back and forth. And then if he traced a different letter, he said my body would sort of resonate, or I'd sway from the left to the right. So something's going on with each of these different letters that is affecting the body in like this antenna format. I don't know what it is. I'd love to know what it is. But the point I'm making is unrelated to our language, where we coldly write, like at school, we coldly write out an essay on Henry V or whatever, and we feel no connection, unless you're a history buff or, a SWAT. You feel no connection to that sort of stuff. You might put part of yourself, in one sense, you put part of yourself into that document that you're learning, but it's not really part of yourself in the way that this is. Well, as Jim typed these symbols out, not only did these symbols contain vast amounts of information, so one simple symbol could contain thousands and thousands. He talked about being downloaded by one symbol. One symbol contained a whole series of encyclopedias. That's another common thread that you hear with contactees and stuff. But the point I wanted to make is what's happening to the body. Is it like some radio transceiver, because we get this thing going on where people start talking about the fact that they sway backwards and forwards, they resonate, they feel different things as they're tracing these symbols. So if you're interested, instead of me playing this, go and have a look on the Exopolitics UK website, find the Jim Sparks interview, make sure you've got a couple of hours free and have a listen, because really the stuff that he said is quite fascinating. And actually those 2 pages with those interviews on have always been the most visited page on the site for years. So it's something people are interested in. Okay, so coming back to the end and the Tower of Babel, again, a slightly different image. I love all these images that people have done of all these things, because, again, if it's a myth, is it a myth or is it a reality? Are they going to find it one day? Did it get knocked down by some group? I don't know. But what of course seems to be going on with this, you look at things like these indigo kids at the moment, really strange phenomena. They seem to have a different approach to language, certainly with concepts and stuff. If you say to these indigo kids, it's like, well, is it a good thing that we're damaging the earth? And they wired into their heads is like, well, what a stupid question, why are you asking me that? Whereas I'm sure if you asked a load of kids in the 70s, my age, that sort of thing, then you'd get a sort of wishy-washy answer. But the point is, something different. These kids are wired something slightly differently. And I'm wondering whether most of you know what synesthesia is. Well, again, with regard to the use of the psychedelics and also regards to use of something that's happening on these ships when people are tracing these symbols, there's something else going on with the body. There's something else going on with the way the body becomes this holographic device, and you often get these synesthesia-like qualities to this process of learning. And so I am wondering if what we've been taught is actually backwards, and far from the fact that we started off as apes going goo, 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 ga, ga, ga. Actually, what happened was at a certain point when we were seeded as quite a sentient sort of race on this planet and began to learn to build houses, agriculture, all that sort of stuff, part of Atlantis, whatever take you want, there's numerous takes out there. There's one theory that's backed actually by someone like Noam Chomsky, who claims that he's done all this work on language, apart from these 3 main parts that he thinks language is built upon and constitutes. On top of that, he claims that when you burrow down underneath this, you have a universal human language. We all share this deep structure of language. Now, where does that come from? Contactees have also had that said themselves. One of the famous Swedish ones, Billy Meyer, got given an alphabet that he said he could go anywhere in the galaxy with, and as long as he stuck with this alphabet, I think there was a series of something or other stones, tablets, then he could communicate with any race and stuff. So again, the universal language, what sort of thing is going on? So my theory with the Tower of Babel, and a lot of other people's theory, is that far from us learning language, what actually happened was we were a seeded experiment. We were put on the planet, and we developed a bit too quick, maybe with the use of psychedelic plants, maybe not, I don't know. We developed this ability to communicate with each other telepathically, and on top of that, rumour was, if you read some of the educated people who actually have takes on the whole Tower of Babel thing and Genesis generally and the whole biblical aspect, is that the gods were angry with us because we were advancing too fast. So we were starting to become godlike and could actually commune with the gods using this telepathic ability that we developed. So, of course, the gods who wanted if you read Sitchin, they wanted a slave race to mine gold and wash their feet. If you read other people, it's for different reasons. Well, they wanted to stop us getting too powerful, whatever it was. So what better way to do it than to use forget the Tower of Babel in that sense, use some techno device that they put down on the Earth, or they zapped the Earth with, and that gave us a collective amnesia. There's talks in other, if you go to the Nag Hammadi texts and the other scrolls that they found, there's talks that language was fragmented into many parts, which is what we've got today. You can trace these roots of language. So, by some mad techno device, the ETs came down, or a certain group of ETs came down, and our language was split. We were too psychic, we were too connected, they didn't like it, we were starting to challenge them. This goes with a lot of myth and history that we've been told, that people like David Hatcher-Childress talk about, many other people. So something else was going on, and I think the Tower of Babel is this metaphor for saying, the gods came down, used some techno device, and they split humanity's language, and we got split all over the earth. They created division, which, if you think about it, this is what do the Illuminati do? What do these people who think they're gods do? They like creating division, divide and conquer, all this sort of stuff. That's their main aim. They want to keep us in a certain position. Well, of course, if we're all telepathic, if you can see what someone means, then you don't really have to have an argument with them. There's no accident why we call these phrases what we do. And so I think underneath, as we said about Wittgenstein, who is a great believer in that everything that we said was based pictorially in our head. So whatever we did, when we describe an orange, it's because we've seen an orange in our head. Well, for me, I don't believe in accidents with language. So when someone's describing what someone said, and they said, they painted a really good picture of their day out in Skegness, or whatever it was, they painted a really good picture of that. Or when we say something like, something clicks inside me, go, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. These aren't accidental. These are going deep down into the matrix of our linguistic system, which is lying there dormant beneath us. All we're doing with this language that I'm using at the moment to express to you, and we express to each other all the other time in written language, all we've done is building on this long-winded way on top of this. And so we can say thank you to the people who came and used the Tower of Babel techno device to actually stop that psi connection, that telepathic connection. We can say thank you to them for that. They did it for their own reasons, but our job now is to get back out of that situation and to get back into a situation where, especially because DNA is shifting at the moment, we know there's lots of stuff going on with DNA. We need to get into this situation that I personally think there's a feedback loop between DNA and language. And so it's basically trying to find out, well, the more we get used to using these linguistic abilities, this whole idea of a visual language to communicate, the more we can actually get on with making the world a slightly better place. I'm going to skip some of this. One interesting point that you should look through, again, if you're interested in this, if you're a real science buff, go and check on the internet for Terence McKenna's theory on hypercarbylation. Sounds really I can get it off me at the end, hypercarbylation or electron spin resonance. They found a way in which they could manifest reality using the vocal cords of their throat, and they essentially they interfaced with the atom itself of reality. Go and look that bit up. The other thing to look up is the whole lot. We've all heard about junk DNA. There's lots of stuff. The Star Child skull by Lloyd Pye had lots of stuff done on that. But more than that, go and look at this thing that they call the language gene. This was a sideways insertion of our genetics. In other words, it didn't come naturally. Some ET group or whoever came along and inserted genetically this FOXP2 gene into us, and it's called the language gene. It didn't give us language. What it did do is gave us the propensity all of a sudden to develop things like vocal cords, and it also acted on the brain to produce part of the brain that could then deal with language, which again, no other primate, no matter how much you train a monkey for years on end, they will never ever get that because they haven't got this gene that allows them to do that. So those are things you can check out. So I'm going to read these last points and we're done. So when the human nervous system and or collective culture is confronted by both psychedelics and interfacing with advanced ET cultures, it acts as a catalyst to language and thus to consciousness. So that's one main point that we've been and covered. 2, evolution of the body, where tones and visual communication turn the nervous system into a higher bandwidth holographic receiver. Well, that's written slightly badly, but that's basically what I'm saying, that there's something to do with tones. We all heard about colour healing at the moment and people using sounds to sort of heal. Well, there's something to do with use of psychedelics and probably use of lighting and sound as well that tunes DNA. DNA is one long big antenna, and we can tune this, and we can tune ourselves into these higher, more aware beings that can probably get past the Dick Cheney factor and start talking to some intelligent life. DNA, also called the language of life, as I mentioned, it's an antenna and is influenced by a variety of environmental factors. And of course, one of those things that I'm mentioning is, of course, the sun, which we're in the 2012 era. The sun at the moment is sending all sorts of weird cosmic rays out. So, what's going on is there's something to do with the sun that's shifting DNA at the moment, and some people are a bit asleep to all this. It may not happen to those who are awake to this and are happy for this sort of situation to be about and are interested in moving forward and going out into space. Do they attract a certain sort of different cosmic light, and hence, changes start taking place? Okay, so coming back to the start of the point, current war, which I firmly believe, and I think we'll see this more and more in not in our newspapers, but I think you'll see more and more as we mix in the alternative media and we talk to people. The war for control of the ET communication point is currently at its apex point. This is why contactees are getting the crap that they're getting at the moment. This is why when you go on YouTube or fucking Facebook, then you find that anyone that's discussing contactee cases or even the UFO issue get people laughing at them still, although there's been a noticeable decline in that, I've noticed, in the last 5 years. But that's because there's a war on for this stuff. That's why the government continues to lie stupidly over swamp gas when they're making utter fools of themselves. So it's all about reality selection, and, we can do that. A lot of people, there's a serious point to that. If you listen to us, people like Jeff Rentz, who big radio DJ from, going years, he claims that, he's had people on his show for years, very educated man. There's all these theories out there that say in the mid-'80s, we came to the point of no return. It's nothing to do with peak oil and stuff. It's to do with the fact that population, everything else, all these things taken into account, we've gone too far to be able to go back. We've now gone to this point of no return. But, of course, we might as well shoot ourselves if that's the case. The other choice is we take into account a little bit more that these people may have been a bit involved in our evolution and therefore may also continue to help us with our ET evolution and communication. And that's me done. Thank you.
Well, you are stalwarts. So we really squeezed a 2-day conference into a 1-day conference, because I felt that what everybody had to say was just so important, and how often do you get an opportunity to get this quality of people together. So I think you've had a real treat today. And again, I'd just like to thank everybody for participating. You guys for coming and listening. Thank you very much. I think we broke even. And I hope that this is the beginning of more Ammach work out there, especially in terms of perhaps conferences and who knows. Yeah.
I'll just say that because Joanne and Mars have worked really hard for this, and it's in Nottingham, which is quite central. So if we do an event once a month, if you could tell everyone and we get newsletters out, you know, we could do with everyone's support, and we can try and get this room full just once a month. We could make a huge difference. Sorry.
Yeah, that's great. That was just something David and I were just running by each other earlier on, and it's a great idea. You know, we've got one or two new people here today and new speakers, and I, you know, really, again, I say I just applaud you all for being here and being part of this, because it is, you know, still fringe.
And getting out there and pushing it forward and standing up and being counted. That's the most important thing. And congratulations to the witnesses and those who stand up. I think that's the important thing.
Absolutely.
Oh, you know, we need something else that's actually going to sort of titillate people a bit and get their interest going. So I'm trying to bring in a few new dimensions here, so bear with me for a bit. You'll see where this fits in at the end. So I'll just start. I'm aware of I'm pushed for time, so I'm just going to keep checking this now and then. Okay. Right. Okay, so I mentioned before about the flow of ET communication and how, you know, there's this battleground now between the satellite government, who, don't forget, are infinitely funded. All of us have probably broken the bank trying to get here, certainly to other conferences. If you attend just British conferences alone, if you attend 3 a year, that's a hefty amount of money in travel and tickets and hotels and everything else. So, you know, it's unfortunately the military have a limited budget, so they can do all this sort of thing. They can follow contactees around. They can take down ships and interview ETs and think they're getting the information from that. We can't do that, so we need another sort of approach. Of course, in 1947, the US basically brought about the national security state, as discussed in depth by people like Richard Dolan. And so that goes into the whole idea that essentially after Roswell, the national security state, which of course wasn't just American, this spread all over the world. Whatever America does, they make sure by their little satellite diplomatic agents, whatever else, that also takes place. Using control of the media, they basically get the say on how we should respond to the ET issue. So at the moment, there's a lot of weird things going on. We're in this, what we call I call the post-Roswell time frame. Everything's changed since that time.
The Ammach Project.
So welcome everybody. After the little break, we have David Griffin of Exopolitics UK, and how wonderful for us, he's a local lad. The alien language is the subject, and we're going to hear some amazing stuff. So as time is short, I'm going to let David get straight on with it. And big round of applause, please, for David. 1, 2, 2. Okay.
Hi there. Nice to see you all here. I don't know if you can get this a tiny bit. I'm a bit taller than that. I'd like to say, that's great, I'd like to say this is the first event in Nottingham in, 7 years of doing these events and jetting off to like Liverpool and Southampton and various other places, Leeds. So it's very nice. I'm very proud that Joanne and Miles worked so hard to get a small gathering of people here. And I was just talking to Joanne before. at the end of the last talk and saying how it's a nice venue and hopefully we can do something here, perhaps on a monthly basis, or just get something going, because it's just far nicer. I don't know who came to Liverpool last time, but the venue's very good, and you get a few more local people in, and the radio station there supported us for our last two. We had an ET communications event and a general exopolitics event, but the venue isn't the best there, and a lot of people don't like it. So this is plush surroundings, and it's good to see you all here. I hope you've all had a good day. I was a bit late, I'm afraid. As some of you will know, if you're Ammach devotees and you watch all their videos that do quite well online and have some quite cutting-edge stuff as far as things go, then you'll have seen some really interesting talk. Contactees, on the other hand, abductees, whatever, on the whole, not always, tend to strike up a different sort of relationship, and they get different sorts of information. Hence, you get these rather desperate men in black types who then follow, they have technology, they can find out where sources have been and perhaps an abduction has taken place. They then go and follow, as I met Chantel outside, as she'll tell you. They just magically turn up at these places where contact has taken place, and they then grill, sometimes quite violently. Many of us could name numerous cases where contactees and those that have been with them have been injured because these nefarious satellite groups, again, it's not the government, these are satellite groups that exist around the government. They want to know the information that those people have been given. So anyway, that was the talk at Leeds that I did. This one basically broadens it out a little bit, and I'm trying to broaden because I mix with a lot of the people from the European Exopolitics Initiative, a wide group of people, very active, very, very switched on people in their own way. In September 2008 or 9, I forget, Joanne was there, so she'll remind me. We had a meeting in Spain, and we had 1,500 people attend in this huge hotel. So 1,500 people for an event with exopolitics in the title shows you the appetite for this stuff. Unfortunately, you're the brave souls that come out and are prepared to come, and travel is expensive, etc. You'll come and attend events like this. The same with Liverpool, not a great turnout, but the same people turn up. We need to get this to the same sort of stage that is in Europe, where people are excited and will turn up and come to these things. So my attempt at trying to get this issue of exopolitics out of this realm of it's all to do with file release. Nick Pope's released yet another file, then David Clarke's waffling on about another file, and a pilot's seen another light in the sky. It's just like, I interviewed a certain person who gave me an insight in how they were being tutored by these ETs on board these craft in a very, very bizarre way, and with some very bizarre methods of teaching them a new language, and it's a language like no other. It's a language that's totally different to us learning French at school on a blackboard with a few verbs. This is a paradigm shift in that, and other people have written about this. The guy called Mario Pasaglini did a lot of stuff on this years ago, and so it's an area I wanted to explore. Previous at Leeds, I did one on ETs interfacing humanity, or something along those lines, and basically saying that there's a struggle going on between the power structures and contactees. And I firmly believe that in this century, as things gear up, you can see that the power groups, or Illuminati, whatever we want to call them, are getting more and more desperate, to the point that we hear, if we believe certain phrases, that they are going after contactees from a young age and either killing them or doing various things to try and stop them progressing into more enlightened beings that can then talk to the rest of us. So there is a war on for this, and that was my theme of my last talk at Leeds, that in the 21st century, there is a war on for contactee information. Who controls the flow of contactee information? Because whoever controls that flow is going to control the future. Forget technology, forget everything else. It's the communication flow between ETs and ourselves that matters. And unfortunately, as we all know, it's the military that get most of this in a certain way, especially with that certain rather rogue, in most cases, grey species. It's the military that's usually by slamming these greys into a jail, some sort of prison or science lab, then they try and get them to talk. From many people, including Simon Parks and Chantal, who I've had the pleasure of meeting outside. Really cutting-edge stuff that no one else dares put out, even on the realms of the Wild West of YouTube and stuff like that, where people won't tarnish their names and put out contactee stuff. Essentially, I started the first exopolitics node, framework, website, group, whatever you want to call it, outside of the US continent. It was a big thing, if any of you know the history, with people like Steve Bassett, who run the Paradigm Research Group, and Dr. Michael Saller, who set up the Exopolitics Institute, Alfred Weber, all those sort of people. And so they kicked it off in the US, and then slowly but surely we've now got, I think, 38 nations represented around the world and a cities initiative. As part of this, especially with the European lot, there's been a sort of a slight inkling toward, they'd rather direct things towards things like file release, what the government are going to do, how the government are going to disclose next week. And really, after you've been in this scene for a few years, you realise that a lot of that isn't going to happen. And one thing that I've always pushed for is that there's nothing wrong with the likes of exopolitics, which compared to ufology is meant to be sort of the respectable end of that. Well, bollocks to that, because I believe in bringing contactee accounts into exopolitics. I think it's the core of what the UFO issue is about. So a lot of my work is done with on the impact of the contactee paradigm within perhaps a political framework. This talk differs very slightly. I've done 2 talks before on alien language. The actual title of this, Sources Call's up there. So Sources Call was something that came around in 2007 when